On the 27th of September 1922, King Constantine I of Greece abdicated his throne after Greece had suffered major military reverses in the Greco-Turkish War. In the weeks that followed, parts of the extended Greek royal family headed into exile. Amongst them was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, who was an infant at the time. How did this exiled member of the Greek royal family go from a royal crisis in the Mediterranean in 1922 to become the consort of the British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II? This is the story of Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, the man who became the Duke of Edinburgh. The man known to history as Prince Philip was born on the 10th of June 1921 on a dining room table in the villa of Mon Repos on the Greek island of Corfu. His birth certificate records his birth as the 28th of May 1921, according to the Gregorian calendar. His father was Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, who was brother to King Constantine I of Greece, making Philip a nephew of the King of Greece at the time of his birth. However, the family was not Greek. Andrew and Constantine's father George was a Danish prince of the House of Glucksburg who had been elected as King George I of Greece in 1863 by the Greek National Assembly, following the deposition of the unpopular King Otto I of the Bavarian House of Wittelsbach. Thus, Philip was a scion of the Danish royal family which had come to rule Greece as a result of the curious dynastic politics of 19th century Europe. Philip's mother was Princess Alice of Battenberg, a daughter of Prince Louis of Battenberg, a German prince. She was also a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the long-lived monarch of Britain during the 19th century. Philip's earliest months involved a trip to the country with which he would become associated throughout most of his life. When he was just 3 months old, his maternal grandfather, Prince Louis of Battenberg, died in London. During the First World War, Louis had adopted the surname Mountbatten to assuage public concerns in England about his partial German heritage. It was a name that Philip would later adopt himself in the same country for similar reasons. Following Louis's death in September 1921, Philip was brought along by his mother to England for the funeral. Back in Greece, late in 1921, he was raised along with his 4 older sisters Margarita, Theodora, Cecily, and Sophie. Philip was the only son of the family, and because of his status as Andrew and Alice's only male child, he was born with a distant position in the line of succession to both the Greek and Danish thrones. Philip's early life was impacted by events in the eastern Mediterranean around the time of his birth. At the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Turkey was effectively occupied by Britain and the other victorious powers of the war. A war of independence broke out as Turkish nationalists, who were eventually led by Kemal Atatürk, attempted to establish a new Republic of Turkey. At first, this new state found itself bombarded on all sides as its neighbors sought to capitalize at its expense. These included Greece, which pressed its claim to the coastal region of western Turkey, claiming that this region had been an historical part of Greece going back thousands of years. The country sought to enforce this claim by engaging in a protracted war against the nascent Republic of Turkey. At first, this was highly successful, and Greek forces occupied the regions under dispute even pressing eastwards towards Ankara. But just weeks after Philip's birth, the Turks went on the offensive after victory at the Battle of Sakarya in central Turkey. This was the beginning of a major reversal of fortunes for the Turks, and by the summer of 1922, Greece was facing a comprehensive military defeat. This had implications for the rule of King Constantine, and by extension Philip and his family. In the face of massive hostility at home in Greece, owing to the defeat by Turkey, King Constantine, Philip's uncle, abdicated on the 27th of September 1922. He headed into exile, while Philip's family soon followed his example. They were rescued from Greece by the British Royal Navy and headed west. It was the beginning of a childhood and early adult life in which Philip was a perpetual exile. As he was only an infant at the time, he had never learned to speak Greek, and Philip stated many years later that he considered himself to be primarily Danish as a member of the House of Glücksburg. Following their exile from Greece in 1922, the family settled in Paris. They had little income and were reliant largely on charity, being provided with a house in the suburb of Saint-Cloud by Andrew's sister-in-law, Princess George of Greece. The family had also been stripped of their Greek citizenship and were now travelling with Danish passports. Exiled, impoverished, and without a place to securely call home, the family's fortunes declined during Philip's early years. By the late 1920s, Andrew and Alice's marriage was disintegrating, and the mental health of Philip's mother had declined considerably. Eventually, she suffered a nervous breakdown and was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1930. She was sent to a sanatorium in Switzerland, while Andrew devoted himself to authoring a book entitled Towards Disaster, the Greek Army in Asia Minor, in which he attempted to rehabilitate his own reputation as a military commander during the Greco-Turkish War. Thereafter, he went to live in the south of France on board a yacht with his mistress, the self-styled Countess André de Labine. Thus, before Philip was even a teenager, his family had effectively collapsed around him. To ensure some semblance of stability in their young son's life, Philip was sent in 1930 to live with relatives in England. There, he resided with Victoria Mountbatten, his maternal grandmother, at Kensington Palace in London, before being sent to the Cheam School in Hampshire, where he completed his elementary schooling by 1933. All four of Philip's sisters married German aristocrats, and Philip himself was sent to attend Schule Schloss Salem in southern Germany in 1933. This was the year that the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler first came to power in Berlin. The Schule Schloss School was soon forced to close its doors and relocate to Scotland, as its founder, Kurt Hahn, was a Jewish educator who faced persecution in Germany under the Nazis. Philip relocated to Scotland too in 1935, where he began attending Hahn's new school called Gordonstoun. Philip would remain at Gordonstoun throughout the mid to late 1930s, and it was an institution which would become closely associated with the royal family for the remainder of the 20th century. While Philip was attending Gordonstoun in the 1930s, the continent's politics were taking a dark turn. Having seized power in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis began rearming Germany. Then, in 1938, an even more aggressive course was set on when the Nazis annexed Austria into a Greater Germany before beginning to make claims on the large German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia later that year. A policy of appeasement by Britain and France failed to prevent further demands, and by the spring of 1939, Hitler and his associates had effectively taken control of all of Central Europe. Moreover, the Nazis increasingly had an ally in fascist Italy, whose leader, Benito Mussolini, had designs on building up a Mediterranean empire which would include countries such as Philip's homeland of Greece. Finally, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on the Nazi regime 2 days later. Philip would soon play a part in the Second World War. He had just joined the Royal Navy College at Dartmouth as a cadet and would serve as a naval officer during the war. This was certainly not nepotism towards a scion of one of Europe's royal houses. Philip finished top of his class at Dartmouth and was then appointed as a midshipman early in 1940. Thereafter, he served briefly in a number of arenas, including a short sojourn in the Indian Ocean, but he was soon pulled back towards his birthplace. The family had been largely rehabilitated in Greece late in 1935, once a successful referendum there to restore the monarchy had passed. Philip's mother, who had recovered from her earlier illnesses and who would go on to play a hero's role in sheltering European Jews from the Nazi regime during the war, had gone back to live in Athens in the late 1930s. Following the invasion of Greece by Germany's ally, Fascist Italy, in the autumn of 1940, Philip was reassigned to the Mediterranean theatre. He fought at the Battle of Kappa-Matapan south of the Peloponnesian Peninsula at the end of March 1941, where the Royal Navy heavily defeated the Italian Regia Marina. His service during this battle, which ensured British control of the routeways between Greece and Crete for some time, was mentioned officially in dispatches by his superior officers. Philip's wartime service continued to take him to different theatres of war in the years that followed. These were emotionally difficult years for him. Members of his extended family, notably his sisters' families through marriage, were fighting on the other side of the war. For instance, Philip's brother-in-law, Prince Christoph of Hesse, who was married to Philip's sister Sophie, was a high-ranking member of the German Air Force and a member of the SS, the Nazi paramilitary organization which ran the concentration camp system. Despite these familial complications, there was no doubting Philip's political loyalties. He was made First Lieutenant of the HMS Wallis in the autumn of 1942 and served with merit during the Allied invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943 to open a southern front against the Axis powers. Thereafter, he was assigned to the Pacific Theatre against the Japanese and was in Tokyo Bay when the Empire of Japan officially surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, bringing the Second World War to an end. Philip continued his naval career in the aftermath of the war, being posted to the HMS Royal Arthur, a Royal Navy shore base in Wiltshire, as an instructor. However, his life was beginning to move in another trajectory altogether. Back in 1939, when he was a cadet at the Naval Training Academy at Dartmouth and she was just a teenager, Philip had been asked to show his third cousin, Princess Elizabeth, the heir to the British crown, around the training academy during a royal visit there. Philip and Elizabeth met again on a number of occasions during the war, and they exchanged letters throughout these years. She was evidently smitten, and when the war ended while he was back in Britain, they began to see each other more often. Thus, in the summer of 1946, a few months after his return to Britain from the Pacific, Philip asked King George VI, Elizabeth's father, for his daughter's hand in marriage. George, no doubt willing to accept Philip as a candidate given his descent from both the Greek and Danish royal lines, and taking into account the fact that there was a genuine affection between Philip and Elizabeth, consented to the marriage. Philip and Elizabeth were married at Westminster Abbey in London on the 20th of November 1947. Several issues had to be resolved before the union. Philip was required to renounce his position in the lines of succession to both the Greek and Danish thrones. A development that was hardly a sacrifice, as there was no real possibility that he would ever succeed to these positions. As he did so, he took up the surname Mountbatten, which his maternal grandfather had adopted in Britain during the First World War. Finally, Philip had to become an official adherent of the Church of England. He was a confirmed Protestant, but he had been baptized as a member of the Greek Orthodox Church in infancy. With all of this resolved, the union was solemnized. The wedding ceremony was broadcast on BBC Radio to an international audience in the Commonwealth nations of hundreds of millions. The marriage soon resulted in children. A son, Charles, was born on the 14th of November 1948, while a daughter, whom the couple named Anne, followed in August 1950. A 10-year hiatus then followed before Andrew, who was named after his grandfather, Philip's father, was born early in 1960. Their final child, Prince Edward, followed in the spring of 1964. Their children would go on to play different roles in British public life. Anne and Edward have largely avoided public attention, but as the heir to the throne and the Prince of Wales, Charles necessarily played an extensive role in his parents' public duties in the decades that were to follow, while Andrew, as we will see, would go on to elicit much public controversy. Each of Philip's sons would be sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland, Philip's former school from the 1930s, for part of their education. Philip was given the title of Duke of Edinburgh on the day of his and Elizabeth's wedding. He was introduced to the House of Lords in the summer of 1948, though he would never play any real role there other than being an honorary member. In the short term, he continued his naval career in the late 1940s. This meant that while he and Elizabeth had taken up residence at Clarence House on the Mall in Westminster in London following their marriage, they were also often abroad, firstly for Elizabeth's duties as heir to the throne, and secondly in Philip's capacity as an officer in the Royal Navy. A lengthy sojourn was spent stationed at Malta in the Mediterranean. Here, Philip was given his most senior posting yet, serving as First Lieutenant of the HMS Chequers, the flagship of the first destroyer flotilla of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. Eventually, in the early 1950s, he was promoted to become a lieutenant commander and placed in charge of the HMS Magpie, a smaller frigate in the Royal Navy, but by that time, Philip's career as a naval officer was beginning to wind down, for Elizabeth was about to succeed as Queen of the United Kingdom. Elizabeth's father, George VI, had become King of the United Kingdom in the final weeks of 1936, following the abdication crisis involving his brother, the short-reigning King Edward VIII. The stress of being king during the Second World War, combined with a lifelong habit of very heavy smoking, had taken its toll on George's health. By the time of Philip and Elizabeth's marriage, his physical condition was already declining, and he was developing both lung cancer and various circulatory problems. By the early 1950s, Elizabeth was having to perform more and more roles as heir to the throne as her father pulled back from public duties. In September 1951, his entire left lung was removed. Just 4 months later, Elizabeth saw him for the last time. George went to London Airport to see her and Philip off as they headed for Kenya, which in those days was still a British colony, and then onwards to Australia. 6 days later, he was found dead at Sandringham House in Norfolk, having perished from coronary thrombosis. He was just 56 years of age, while Elizabeth was only 25 years old as she succeeded as Queen of the United Kingdom. After a lengthy delay, her coronation took place on the 2nd of June 1953. As her husband, Philip now became the royal consort, the title given to the spouse of a queen or king regnant. Philip became the consort of a British monarch at a time when the United Kingdom was entering into a period of great change. During the 19th century, Britain had been the world's foremost superpower. England was the economic powerhouse of the world, the home of the Industrial Revolution. The Royal Navy's ships ruled the waves, and Britain had colonized or conquered vast parts of the globe, notably India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and a huge swathe of Africa from Egypt to South Africa. By the end of the century, though, the country's primacy was being challenged, above all by an ascendant United States. While Britain was able to maintain its empire for decades to come, the Second World War had fatally weakened the country and led to widespread calls for independence in India and Africa. Thus, Elizabeth became queen at a time when Britain's place in the world was about to undergo a profound alteration as it handed over the mantle of Western power to the United States, while at home great social change was in the firmament. It was Elizabeth's role as queen, and Philip's as her husband, to act as the face of Britain in this changing world. Philip's position was challenging in other ways. Britain had nearly always been ruled by kings. Additionally, those few queens who had ruled the country had usually had less than conventional marital situations. For instance, Elizabeth I, who ruled England between 1558 and 1603. After Elizabeth, there were few queens of England, and the primary example, the long-lived Queen Victoria, was a widow for 40 years of her reign. As such, there had been few male consorts to British queens, a position which required the monarch's husband to effectively take a back seat in the affairs which dominated their day-to-day lives. This was not an easy position to reconcile in a society that was still profoundly patriarchal and male-dominated in the 1950s. Nevertheless, Philip would go on to become a rock for Elizabeth in their public lives, while managing to carve out his own public role in many important ways which allowed him to make his own impression on British society without clashing with her role as the monarch. The first years of Elizabeth's reign were difficult ones for Philip in many ways. His relationship with his mother-in-law, the Queen Mother, had always been strained and remained so for several years after Elizabeth's accession. Many others within British society continued to view Philip as a foreign interloper despite his descent from Queen Victoria. One such individual was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had returned to lead a new Conservative government in 1951 and was thus running the country at the time of Elizabeth's accession. This was significant, as there was an issue to be resolved in the first months of the reign concerning the name which the royal dynasty would now bear. The royal family had adopted the name House of Windsor during the mid-1910s to avoid any unrest about their partial German ancestry during the First World War. Elizabeth's accession created an issue at a time when it was accepted practice that women adopted their husband's surname at the time of their marriage. Philip was adamant that the name Mountbatten should be added to the royal title, stating at the time that "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children." Despite his unease, Elizabeth was convinced by Churchill that the name of the royal family should remain as the House of Windsor, though she later had the British Privy Council amend this in 1960 so that their descendants who did not bear royal titles would carry the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. Philip's disappointment was slightly assuaged by the grant of the title of Prince in 1957. Early in the reign, rumours abounded concerning alleged affairs that Philip had had. The prince was a handsome man in his youth and had developed something of a reputation as a flirt in the years before he met Elizabeth. This contributed to the rumours later on, as did the fact that Philip's father had engaged in a very public and somewhat scandalous affair himself while living in the south of France in the 1930s, while he was still married to Philip's mother. Consequently, Philip was repeatedly tied to other women, notably Hélène Corday, an old family friend of Philip's, the actress Anna Massey, and the writer and playwright Daphne du Maurier. There is no credible evidence to substantiate any of these claims, but privately the reports were said to bother Philip. These rumours took on a decidedly serious edge in the early 1960s when Philip was tangentially involved in what became known as the Profumo affair. This erupted in 1963 following revelations that John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War in the Conservative government led by Harold Macmillan, had engaged in an extramarital affair with a 19-year-old model by the name of Christine Keeler. There were numerous issues with this. Firstly, Keeler was less than half Profumo's age at the time, but more controversially, she had been suspected of being involved in a relationship at the same time with Captain Evgeny Ivanov, a naval attaché to Britain of the Soviet Union. If this were true, then Profumo's actions had created a national security risk. Philip was implicated in events as he was an acquaintance of Stephen Ward, an osteopath and artist who had introduced Profumo to Keeler in 1961 prior to the commencement of their affair. The controversy was compounded by details of sex parties involving the British political class and nobility, rumours that further sought to bring Philip's name into disrepute, though again there was no substantive basis to the allegations, and eventually parts of the media began dismissing any suggestion of Philip's involvement as nothing more than foul rumours. Philip had a difficult time early in the reign as a result of all of this, but eventually the tide began to turn and his accomplishments and work as consort began to earn plaudits. One of Philip's greatest achievements as consort was the establishment of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. In 1954, Kurt Hahn, the famed schoolmaster and founder of Gordonstoun in Scotland, met with Philip in London. Hahn had an idea. He wished for his former pupil to start an awards scheme which would be geared towards rewarding teenagers for completing a series of tasks which would counter what Hahn referred to as the 6 declines of modern youth. These were the decline of fitness, initiative and enterprise, memory and imagination, skill and care, self-discipline, and compassion. Hahn convinced Philip that an award scheme would serve to arrest these declines, and Philip agreed. And so the Duke of Edinburgh Awards were born, run on a pilot basis for the first time in 1956. Philip chaired the committee that offered gold, silver and bronze awards to boys aged between 14 and 18 for various accomplishments in acquiring skills, physical activities and services to their community of one kind or another. It seems curious looking back from the vantage point of 60-plus years, but the Duke of Edinburgh Awards were initially quite controversial. The Scouts organisation viewed it as a potential threat to a niche which they had dominated, while it was viewed as a piece of English nationalism in Scotland and Wales, and conversely looked at with some paranoia in England, where some people noted that it resembled the Hitler Youth Organization of Nazi Germany. The doubts were soon dispelled. The awards proved so successful that the scheme was extended to teenage girls in 1958, and by the 1960s, it had become a well-regarded national institution. Moreover, in 1980, it was extended again to include young adults up to the age of 24, while in 1988 the awards were extended internationally. Today, 144 nations take part in the awards, and the scheme, which Philip chaired personally for nearly half a century until he stood down in 2001, has led to millions of awards to young people for their accomplishments. Of the approximately 900 charities that Philip aided in some way during his time as consort, surely this ranks as first amongst them. Another very notable aspect of Philip's patronage and advocacy which appeared early in the reign was his commitment to environmental causes. Philip's views in this regard were substantially shaped by a visit to Antarctica and the South Atlantic in the mid-1950s. Already by the early 1960s, when environmentalism was still largely in its infancy, the Prince was an active advocate of it. His many speeches about conservation and similar causes from 1962 onwards were brought together into a collection some years later and published as one of Philip's many books. He continued to write on the subject, most notably in Survival or Extinction: A Christian Attitude to the Environment, which was published in 1989 just as the science of climate change was becoming unequivocal. This advocacy of environmental causes often had tangible impacts, notably in the saving of the potteroo, an endangered marsupial that is a close cousin to the kangaroo. This was saved from extinction by Philip's support for granting protected status to a section of bushland in Australia called Two People's Bay back in the 1960s. Moreover, this concern for environmental causes is one Philip passed on to his children, and King Charles in particular has become a vocal conservationist. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the range of charitable causes that Philip advocated on behalf of continued to grow, even as he and Elizabeth made almost daily public appearances and toured the world on state visits. A supporter of the arts and an amateur painter himself, he served as a patron of the Royal Society of Arts throughout these decades and would continue to down to 2011. However, it was architecture that was his primary interest in terms of material culture, taking a keen interest in the royal estate and the design of the monarchy's main castles. His interests mixed with horticulture in this respect, and he also oversaw the redesign of the grand gardens at Windsor Castle. At Sandringham House, he became the first person to successfully cultivate black diamond truffles in Britain after nearly 50 years of experimentation to achieve this feat. More broadly, in terms of architectural work in the nation at large, he established the Prince Philip Designers Prize in 1959 to celebrate Britain's architects and designers. Over the years, it provided a platform for some of Britain's most esteemed architects, notably Norman Foster, the man who went on to design the Gherkin, one of London's most recognisable buildings today. While Philip's charitable work and advocacy was doubtlessly significant, one of his most important roles was as a father within the royal family, one where he occupied a fairly traditional patriarchal position, despite Elizabeth's seniority in the country at large. There seems little disputing that his and Elizabeth's only daughter, Anne, was the child of whom Philip was fondest. When interviewed in the 1970s, Philip stated that Anne had inherited most clearly his directness and practicality, with many noting that as she grew older, Anne also inherited her father's often wry sense of humour. Additionally, the pair shared a love of equestrian activities, Philip having been a keen polo player throughout his life and Anne having become an avid horse racer. She was, accordingly, the natural choice to succeed Philip some years later when he stood down as president of the International Equestrian Federation. If Philip and Anne's relationship was known to be a close one, that between the prince and his eldest son, Prince Charles, was sometimes volatile. This came to light in a tangible fashion in a biography of Charles published in 1994, for which Charles provided some of the damning evidence himself. Much of this rested on Philip being a frosty character towards his sons in their earlier years. In particular, it was claimed that the prince was critical of what he perceived as an overly sensitive nature in the heir to the throne. There was a difference of demeanour between the pair, one that Philip himself described in the late 1990s by saying, "He's a romantic, and I'm a pragmatist." Yet, despite all of this, there is no doubting that Charles inherited many of his father's interests and concerns. For instance, he has been an even more vocal advocate of environmental and conservationist causes than Philip was. Similarly, their attitudes to architecture, sport, and religion tend to overlap. If there were issues between Philip and Charles over the years, they were greatly exacerbated by the Prince of Wales' tangled love life. In 1977, while dating her sister Sarah, Prince Charles met Diana Spencer for the first time. She was a member of the British nobility and a relative of Winston Churchill's. By 1980, Charles and Diana, who was still only 19 years of age and Charles's junior by 13 years, were seeing each other. When he introduced her to his parents, the Queen and Philip were suitably impressed. This was, after all, a marriage that would have a political edge to it. The assumption at the time was that whoever Charles married would one day become the Queen of England, the successor to Philip as royal consort. Indeed, Philip was so impressed by Diana that within months he was writing to Charles to urge him to marry Diana as soon as possible as, given the standards of royal politics in the early 1980s, a lengthy delay in doing so could prove embarrassing for Diana and the Spencer family. It has been suggested in the intervening years that Charles interpreted this correspondence from Philip as an order of some sort. Whatever the truth of that might be, we do know that Charles and Diana officially announced their engagement on the 24th of February 1981. They were married 6 months later, on the 29th of July 1981. Charles and Diana's marriage would come to define the monarchy in Britain for much of the next 20 years. At first, things went relatively smoothly. Diana found it difficult to acclimatise to her newfound public prominence, though Philip did his best to help her adjust to a situation that he had found himself in as well, over 30 years earlier. 2 sons, William and Harry, were born in 1982 and 1984. However, by the late 1980s, the marriage was beginning to flounder as Charles had entered into an extramarital affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, who was similar in age to Charles and with whom he had been in a relationship on and off again during the 1970s. For her part, Diana was also in a clandestine relationship with Major James Hewitt, a British Army officer, between 1986 and 1991. The friction between the heir to the throne and his wife was a growing subject of media speculation by 1989, as the body language between them during public appearances gave evidence of the rift, and rumours of their respective affairs abounded. By the early 1990s, it was clear that the marriage was doomed, a development that caused the Queen and Prince Philip much disquiet. As Philip later noted, the media's efforts to turn the well-regarded monarchy into a soap opera accelerated during these years. The drama which occurred from the late 1980s onwards for the monarchy was symptomatic of the changed state of Britain since Elizabeth had been crowned in 1952. By the 1990s, the country was a radically different place to what it had been 40 years earlier. Britain's empire was gone, and the country was now part of a union of European countries which the British had been stringently opposed to joining back in 1952 when Elizabeth first became Queen. Large inward migration of people from British Commonwealth countries and other parts of the globe had changed the UK into a multicultural society. This was not always a smooth process. Furthermore, the 1960s and 1970s had seen massive social change in other areas. The trick of being monarch and the monarch's consort was to be the face of a Britain which stood for all the country's people in this rapidly changing and often divided nation. Some of the undercurrents of this changed world were at play in the events of 1992, a year that Queen Elizabeth would come to refer to as the Annus horribilis of her reign, meaning horrible year. The reasons why she and Philip viewed this particular year with such angst were myriad. Firstly, 2 of their children's marriages ended in quick succession in the spring. On the 19th of March, Andrew and his wife Sarah Ferguson announced their separation, while just 5 weeks later, Anne and her first husband, Mark Phillips, finalised their divorce. Andrew and Sarah remained on good terms and continued to live together for many years thereafter, but the split was taken badly by the wider royal family, particularly owing to financial issues, and then a scandal which arose some months later involving Ferguson being photographed topless with a male companion sucking her toes. However, the foremost issue arose around the ongoing fallout from Charles and Diana's marriage and separation. In the summer of 1992, a book entitled Diana, Her True Story, which she was directly involved in the writing of, was published along with excerpts in the British newspapers. This offered intimate details of the problems that had arisen in her and the heir to the throne's marriage, notably Charles's extramarital affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. The appearance of the book was followed just weeks later by the leaking of recorded phone calls between Diana and a male companion of hers called James Gilby, which created further problems for Buckingham Palace. Finally, in November 1992, a major fire broke out at Windsor Castle, the traditional home of the British monarchy. Unsurprisingly, just 4 days after this later event, while giving a speech at the Guildhall in London, Elizabeth stated, 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an Annus horribilis. It was topped off in the closing days of 1992 when Charles and Diana announced their official separation. Philip was bitter about these events and the manner in which the media had covered them. Nearly 10 years later, close confidants of the prince related how he felt the events of the early 1990s had compromised much of what he and Elizabeth had tried to achieve since 1952. The events of 1992 and the revelations made through Diana's biography drove a wedge between the Princess of Wales and the royal family. This was rooted in Queen Elizabeth's lifelong view of the royal family as a firm which did not publicise private issues within the family and acted in unity. The collapse of Diana and Charles's marriage had compromised this, as the royal family's private lives suddenly became tabloid fodder on an almost daily basis in Britain. Such was the level of media intrusion throughout these years that Elizabeth's sister, the Princess Margaret, even burned her own correspondence with Diana to avoid any of it falling into the hands of the media. Things continued to get worse in the mid-1990s, notably following a notorious BBC Panorama interview Diana gave to the now disgraced journalist Martin Bashir in 1995. At last, on the 28th of August 1996, Charles and Diana's divorce was finalised. The royal family's reputation was badly impacted on by the whole affair. Neither side was blameless, but public sympathy lay with Diana, who was perceived as being the victim of a callous royal family and crown institutions. The Queen and Prince Philip were particularly criticised as having turned their backs on their daughter-in-law. Little of this was true, but it was compounded when, in the early hours of the 31st of August 1997, Diana died following an accident in Paris where she and her companion Dodi Fayed had been fleeing in a speeding car while chased by paparazzi. When news arrived to Britain, Diana's sons, William and Harry, who were still teenagers, were at the Balmoral royal estate with their grandparents. In the hours that followed, Charles decided to head to Paris, while the Queen and Prince Philip stayed with their grandchildren. This was the wholly understandable concern of grandparents for their grandchildren, but in the days that followed, the Queen and the royal consort were unfairly criticised for not being more visible in public following Diana's death. A particularly egregious criticism at the time from the media was that flags at Buckingham Palace were not flying at half-mast to acknowledge Diana's death. The Queen was heard at the time bitterly remarking that the newspapers knew full well that flags were never flown at half-mast at the palace, and that would apply too when she herself died. When Diana's funeral was held a week later on the 7th of September 1997 at Westminster Abbey, Philip walked behind the coffin with his son, grandsons, and Diana's brother Earl Spencer. After a hiatus in the 2000s, further familial controversies unfortunately arose in Philip's later years. Beginning with a BBC News report in 2011, it was revealed that his and the Queen's middle son, Andrew, had been friends with Jeffrey Epstein, an American financier who was increasingly adjudged to be guilty of a range of sexual offences, including the grooming of underage teenage girls. In the years that followed, the accusations built to include claims that Andrew had been involved in this activity with Epstein, notably following accusations by Virginia Giuffre, an American woman who claimed she was trafficked to Andrew for sex many years earlier by Epstein and his girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell. Giuffre had been an underage teenager at the time. Eventually, in the early summer of 2020, as the accusations against Andrew mounted, he resigned from his public role as a working royal. Perhaps somewhat fortunately, Prince Philip would not be alive to see Andrew make an out-of-court settlement with Giuffre in February 2022 after she brought legal charges against him, or to witness his complete fall from grace when, in November 2025, he was stripped of his titles, including Prince and Duke of York, and his styling, His Royal Highness, by his brother, King Charles. At the same time that the controversy around Andrew was developing, another issue had arisen concerning Philip's grandson Harry, the younger son of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. In 2018, he had married Meghan Markle, an American actress, and the pair were granted the titles of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The intention was that they would be working royals who would begin to take over some of the public duties which Philip had been stepping back from in the 2010s and had retired fully from in 2017 owing to his old age. However, by 2020, at the same time Andrew was resigning from his public duties, Harry and Meghan also abandoned their role as working royals, claiming excessive media intrusion had driven them to the decision, and that they would be relocating to America. Perhaps one of the saddest aspects of this entire affair was that Harry and Meghan would give a lengthy interview to the American broadcaster Oprah Winfrey early in March 2021, in which they criticised the royal family on a wide range of matters, although Harry's criticisms were primarily reserved for his father and brother, rather than his grandparents. Nevertheless, for the 99-year-old Prince Philip, the interview was a blow shortly before his own death. He also deemed Harry's decision to proceed with it as madness, given the manner in which the media had at least partly contributed to his mother's death. In the new millennium, Philip began to gradually step back somewhat from his official duties. The prince celebrated his 80th birthday in 2001. A year earlier, he wryly commented in an interview that "bits of me are falling off already." Yet, despite being an octogenarian, he continued throughout the 2000s to play an active role as royal consort. This changed, though, in 2011, when he celebrated his 90th year, as health problems had been inevitably occurring for some time by that point. Just weeks after the milestone birthday in 2011, he was admitted to hospital and treated for cardiac problems. A bladder infection followed in 2012. As a result, Philip incrementally divested himself of the many positions he still held as chair, president, or patron of numerous charities, foundations, and causes, often relinquishing these roles to his children, or increasingly to his grandchildren and other members of the extended royal family. Finally, in August 2017, he retired from his royal duties at 96 years of age. By that time, he had completed over 22,000 solo engagements as royal consort over a 64-year period. In March 2020, the spread of the COVID-19 virus, which had emerged in China some months earlier, was officially declared to be a pandemic by the World Health Organization. Given their advanced years, Philip and the Queen were both highly vulnerable. However, While Philip passed away during the pandemic, it was not from the viral disease. He died at home in Windsor Castle on the 9th of April 2021. His cause of death was simply given as old age. Philip had only been weeks short of his 100th birthday. By the time that he died, he was the longest-serving royal consort in world history, having served for 68 years. But despite the death of such a long-standing servant of the state, Britain was unable to mourn his passing in the way that would have been desirable, as severe restrictions on gatherings, including those at funerals, were still in place in Britain in the late spring of 2021 owing to the pandemic. Thus, when Philip's funeral was held on the 17th of April 2021 at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, only a small contingent of close family members were able to attend. This Spartan ceremony was later juxtaposed against the recklessness which prevailed within government at the time, when it subsequently emerged that Boris Johnson's senior civil servants were regularly holding parties at 10 Downing Street, even as Philip's funeral was being arranged. Laying her husband of over 73 years to rest was one of the last major events of Elizabeth's reign. Her health deteriorated swiftly after his passing, and she died a year and a half later on the 8th of September 2022. With this, their eldest son finally succeeded as King Charles III. Prince Philip was the longest-serving royal consort in world history. One does not live that long in the public eye without leaving an indelible impression. Invariably, that impression has had highs and lows. The latter, unfortunately, bookended much of his time as royal consort. In the 1950s, Philip suffered from a lot of negative publicity as a result of his partial German ancestry and the perception of him as an outsider. His relationship with Elizabeth's mother, and indeed with the Prime Minister of the early 1950s, Winston Churchill, was poor, and he was not happy with the inability to pass his surname on to his and Elizabeth's children. A honeymoon period followed for him and the Queen between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s, but trouble arose from various avenues again in the 1990s. This started with most of their children's marriages ending in divorce, most messily in the case of Charles and Diana. Then, in the final years of his life, the controversies surrounding Andrew's behaviour and Harry and Meghan's split from the royal family created fresh problems. Yet, it would be wrong to focus on the negatives. The prince should surely be more remembered for a lifetime of royal service. His activity as a royal consort was immense. As well as making over 22,000 solo appearances as royal consort, a sum which amounts to just under 1 appearance per day for every day of the 64 years he actively served as royal consort, he gave nearly 5,500 speeches and travelled with the Queen on every state visit throughout that same period. In his 80th year alone, he carried out 559 engagements. Much of this staggering workload was concerned with highly relevant causes, notably the prince's commitment to environmentalism and conservation. But most notably, in founding and chairing the Duke of Edinburgh Awards from 1956 onwards. But perhaps Philip's most substantial role was in acting as a rock of support for Queen Elizabeth in a long life of public service. As Philip himself told a biographer, he believed his job was to ensure the Queen can reign. The Queen herself clearly believed Philip had succeeded in this, stating towards the end of his life that he is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years. And I, and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know. Few could have put it better. What do you think of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh? Was he England's greatest royal consort? Or were others, like his mother-in-law, the Queen Mother, more formidable? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.